This is the Egyptian gallery, or one of the Egyptian galleries at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and I wanted to start off here because this is where the project started. One particular object that's been on display for the last 20 or 30 years actually inspired the Afro comb project. The comb dates to around 5,000 or 5,500 years ago, and it's very typical of the type of combs that we see from early Egypt. The teeth are very long, they have quite wide gaps in between, and as you can see from the comb, one of them is actually broken, probably because it was used. At the top of the comb, it's quite interesting because I suppose in some respects as a parallel to the black fist that you see on a lot of modern Afro combs, we see an ancient symbol. It seems to represent bull's horns, and this particular symbol was quite common in early Egypt, and it represents fertility and also strength. It's a very masculine symbol, and so perhaps the person who was buried with this comb could have been a man. We're not sure because we don't have the excavation reports to tell us. If we look at some other objects, again from the same period, we can see very similar symbolisms or motifs appearing on the pottery. If you have a look at the pot, you can see an early man, probably a hunter-gatherer, and he's standing very close to a boat, probably on the River Nile. And in between him and the gazelle that he's hunting, you can see a standard or what looks like a flagpole. And on the top of that pole is exactly the same symbol that you see on the top of the comb. Hairstyles were very important to both men and women in ancient Egypt, and we have lots of examples here in the galleries. But I wanted to look at one example in particular that dates to about 3,800 years ago, which represents a woman wearing a type of hairstyle that was very, very popular at the period. And similar to people in modern days, there were fashions of hair in ancient Egypt and also in ancient Sudan. This particular hairstyle is known as a Hathor hairstyle. It's quite often called a Hathor wig. And that's because it's associated with a goddess who was called Hathor, who was linked and associated with fertility, and was also linked with women and leading them through to the afterlife. This type of hairstyle would have necessitated quite thick, coarse hair in order to hold it in place. And you can see very clearly that it's very thick at the top and then is narrower towards the bottom where it curls round into two large curls. Only women of status seem to have worn this hairstyle, and this particular statue belonged to a woman who we think was a singer and so would have been linked to the priesthood as a priestess. Also in this case, we see a representation of another female form, probably a fertility figure that was buried with someone to lead them and connect them to the afterlife and their rebirth in it. But what's interesting about this particular statue is that the woman seems to have a weave or an attachment at the back of her already quite thick hair. The hair is depicted as being sort of curly and coarse on the sides, and then it's much, much thicker at the back. We've got a fragment of a coffin here that dates to a similar period to the statues that we just had a look at. We have a very different hairstyle. The woman's hair's gone into dreadlocks, and she's actually part of a funeral procession. She's a mourner. We don't know whether she's professional, whether it was a member of the family. You can see that she's crying and she's also beating her breast, and this was very typical of people who were mourning in ancient Egypt. It's interesting because in some very traditional African cultures, there are accounts of women not styling or perhaps combing their hair when they were mourning or in the process of mourning. So this is a really nice connection between the ancient world and more modern African cultures. It looks like a traditional Afro comb but with two sides. We think is very late. It has a depiction of an animal, maybe a sheep or a gazelle on it, and it dates to what we call the late antique Coptic or Christian periods. We've actually had some of our combs that look like this style radiocarbon dated because we're not 100% sure what date they are. So as part of the project, in about 3 months' time, we should actually find out. The other comb that looks a bit more like a traditional European comb is actually earlier. It's probably just over 3,000 years old. And what happens is we lose hair combs for a period of about 1,500 years, probably not because people weren't combing their hair, but because they weren't buried with them. And then once we get into the New Kingdom, we find that they reappear, but they appear in a very different form. As part of the research for the exhibition, I'm going to be looking at this in some more detail, but the two are contrasted really quite well in this particular case. These are some of the earliest combs that we have in the Fitzwilliam Museum and also associated accessories. And the reason I say that is because we're still trying to work out what some of them might have been used for. They're all made out of ivory or bone, and they date to around 6,000 years ago, so they're incredibly early. They were found in graves, and they were found in both male and female graves. And in some of the excavation reports, when Petrie, who excavated a lot of tombs in Egypt, particularly at this early period, he mentions that some of the combs were away from the body and had hair, human hair, wrapped around them. The first example is connected, although it's slightly earlier, to the one that we had a look at in the gallery, and that's this one here. And rather than bull's horns, you have two birds. This double bird motif, or symbol as it was known and identified by Petrie, he was the first person who actually did a typology of hair combs, was really important during this period, and it's one of the most commonly found on the handles of Afro combs. You can see here that the teeth have also broken, and there aren't any wear marks, which again might suggest perhaps that this particular comb was either worn in the hair, perhaps as a status symbol, or that it was actually made specifically to be put in the burial with the deceased. The next hair comb, we're not certain of the date. It seems to be a combination of two different styles, but because it's made out of bone, we think it's probably early. It doesn't have an exact find spot because it was actually given to the museum in 1943, and it was part of a large collection that was housed in Cairo. It belonged to somebody called Geir Anderson. There's actually a museum in Cairo that's named after him today, which the house is where he lived. There aren't any teeth left, but there are notches, and it looks as if they were possibly worn down. And on the top, the handle is actually in the form of another goddess, Taweret, who was a pregnant hippopotamus goddess. Now, she doesn't normally appear in pre-dynastic art or culture, and so that's why the question of the date of this particular example is still open. But we're hoping, if we can, to take a small sample to get it tested. If we can radiocarbon date it, which we can do with bone and ivory, then that should give us a more certain date. The next two combs are very similar, and I use the term comb loosely because they're incredibly fragile. They're both made out of ivory. They come from two early sites in Egypt, Abydos, which was the same site as the first comb, except this is earlier still, and Hierakonpolis, which is a very well-known pre-dynastic site, again in the southern part of Egypt. It seems that these two examples may have been worn in the hair to decorate the hair. And again, they come from a grave context, but there were no descriptions of whereabouts in the grave they were found. But we do know from other burials, examples that are housed in Oxford today, for example, that hair combs and pins and ornaments were actually found in the hair of the deceased. It's possible that hair combs were actually used as amulets, and these were kind of charms that would protect people from evil, or who would help people through to the afterlife. Again, we're not sure where this particular example came from. It was excavated and probably came into the museum over 100 years ago, but it's lost its exact find spot. It has numbers marked on it which show that it was excavated though, and it would have come into the museum in this particular way. What's interesting about it is that there is, in other African cultures, most notably in Ghana, a history of using the hair comb to symbolise more than simply a functional thing. In Ghana, on textile fabrics, the Afro comb appears as a symbol of fertility and beauty, and it's possible that the ancient people used hair combs in the same way, particularly when they were buried, because these objects would protect them and serve them in the afterlife.